Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at HTML forms. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, client, and server-side scripting. Now, specifically in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to create an HTML form that then references a PHP resource on an Apache web server. Now, this video is going to assume that you've watched some of the earlier videos on HTML and preferably the earlier video on HTML forms, and that you already have a PHP and a PHP tied into your Apache server. Now, what type of Apache server you have running, what environment you're on should not matter. And technically, it doesn't even have to be an Apache server as long as you have PHP support. Now, additionally, in this video, I'm going to also show you some very basic troubleshooting. In other words, I'm going to assume that you don't actually have your Apache web server up and running yet. And so we're going to do a number of wrong things in this video. So to begin with, you'll notice that I simply have a vision of what I'd like for our form to look like. It's no different than a couple of the earlier videos, so you might want to take a screenshot of this. And you'll also notice the resources that we're using will be the HTML forms page from the W3 schools, although we are going to do some things a little bit different than they have done. Additionally, you may want to go ahead and look at the earlier video for the collect_02. I've got it up on the screen right now if you wish to do a screenshot and simply pause the video and copy what I have here. I will be starting this one over from scratch, though, in case you'd like to just follow along with the example. So the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and create a new HTML page. And we are simply going to call this one collect_03. And we're going to go ahead and save it. And we're going to go ahead and save it as collect_03. And again, you probably want to go back and change the names as you get a little more sophisticated. Now, just like in the earlier example, what we want to do is we want to start off with a form. You can optionally change the style now that you sort of appreciate what is going on with the styling of a form as it relates to both the style and the structure. We're going to go ahead and continue on with it, at least for this video. And we are going to include the action. And if you recall from the earlier video, the action is what gets done when the form is submitted. So we're going to have a submit button as well. And I haven't yet written this, but we are going to specify now a process_03. And unlike before, where we just had an HTML page that really didn't do anything, we are actually going to specify a PHP server-side script. And then at this point, we can simply just close the tag. And what we want to do is we want to add a label. As a matter of fact, we're going to add a couple of labels. The first one being, of course, for the first name, text. Give it a nice look. So first name, colon, and the space. And then the input, and again, the type for this is going to be text. The ID, which is arguably the most important thing, or at least along with the name, we have our first name _text, and then the name, which is going to be used when the submit button is pushed. That's going to identify the fields which we want to pull values out and pass to our second resource. In other words, in this case, our process_03.php. And so in this case, we simply want to call this one first name, and then we can have an optional default value. Again, it's imperative with the forms that you have a name for the individual parameters. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this as a get. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and explicitly mention this up here. I'm going to say method equal to get. In a later video, we'll talk a little more about posts. And then we want to go ahead and add a line and then simply repeat the process for the email. So we have for, and then I'm going to assume that I'm going to give it an ID of email text Again, try to make it functional, but at least somewhat aesthetically pleasing, I guess I should say. And I'll set the type as email, text. The name, again, is arguably shares in its responsibility of being the most important, the two most important things, the ID and the email, excuse me, the ID and the name. And then lastly, the value. Again, another line break. And then finally, we have our button. Now, again, as we talked about in earlier videos, we could do this with a regular button and then have an on-click event that fires off some JavaScript and then have some code for validation. We'll handle that in a later video. In this case, what we're going to do is we're simply going to specify the type equal to a submit, and probably about the only other thing that I want to change then will be the background color to something that sort of matches what I had in the original layout that I wanted. At this point, we are pretty much ready to go with the HTML. As a matter of fact, we can go ahead and save this. We can simply come out to our file system. We can find our collect_03.html. We can click on it, and there it is. As a matter of fact, we can go ahead and fill in some information here. I'm going to go ahead and put my first name, put my email address, then hit submit. And again, it simply attempts to access a resource that in this case doesn't yet exist. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to see that we've got a couple of extra steps here. But the most important thing to notice right now is that it's attempting to access a process_03.php. And again, we have a question mark indicating the query parameters, and then each of the parameters in a name value pair separated by an ampersand, with the name and value simply separated by an equal sign. Now, how do we get this to work? Well, the first thing that we want to do is simply create that PHP script. So we're going to come back over to your IDE. Again, which IDE you use doesn't really matter. And what we want to do is we want to create our PHP script. Now, I'm going to keep this PHP script relatively simple. We'll embellish it later on. Effectively, all we're going to do is we're going to take the information that is passed to our web server, and we're simply going to modify it a little bit and spit it out back to the user. But the first thing that we want to do is we want to figure out how can we collect that information from the query parameters in the URL that was passed. And it turns out, well, with PHP, we've got a number of things that we need to learn. First of all, the way that you identify a variable in PHP is simply using the $, and then you specify the first name. And the rules for the variables are pretty much similar to many other programming languages, aside from the $. At this point, then, what we're going to do is we're going to use a built-in PHP function called get. And what it does is it simply pulls the values out of the query parameter array. In other words, all of the parameters that are being passed to the server, and it pulls out those parameters by the name designated in the parameter. In other words, basically what we can do is we can simply say that we would like to get the first name field from the query parameter, and we would like to assign it to our first name variable. Now, I do realize I'm throwing quite a bit at you in this video. I figured you just go ahead and jump in there and get started. We'll actually talk about the PHP resources that we have at our disposal. But right now, what we want to do is simply understand how the HTML forms work and how they can be used with a server-side resource. We'll repeat this with the email variable. We'll again simply use the get, and we'll pull it out based on the name, that named parameter that was passed from the collect_03.html. And then what I'd like to do is I'd simply like to use the echo function in PHP. and just pass along something like a welcome message. And with PHP, you can concatenate a string by simply using a period. So what we'd like to say is welcome period. And then what we'll do is we'll simply grab the first name, whatever the value that was provided by the user, followed by some exclamation points and something like, thank you for submitting your email. And what we'll do is we'll simply pair it back to the user, what email the server received. And that should be enough for this particular example. Again, you've got a couple of things going on here. We're using PHP to respond back to the request made by the action in the form when it was submitted. So we can go ahead and save this. We're going to call this one process_03. And the reason that I'm calling it 03 is just simply because it matches then my collect_03. And then what we'll do is we will go find those files, specifically our collect_03.html. We're going to launch it once again in our web browser. We'll put our name in there, my email address in there, and I'm going to click submit. And this time, at least we don't get that the resource wasn't found. We do, however, probably not get what you were expecting, in that we would have liked to have seen some fancy welcome message that pulled out the user's name and their email address. Instead, what we get is the text associated with the PHP script. In other words, it's exactly what we were typing in our IDE. And that is simply because we aren't actually using our Apache web server at this point. In other words, we're not really parsing the PHP. We're just simply using your favorite web browser to open files on your hard drive. And that's not what we want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow along with the additional steps of starting up your Apache web server. If you have any issues with your Apache web server, I encourage you to watch some of the earlier videos on setting it up and configuring PHP. And in this case, I'm going to assume that you've already done that. So to start with, I'm going to fire up my command window. I'm going to cd to my software directory, which is where I have my Apache installation. I'm going to cd into the bin directory, and I'm going to start my HTTPD daemon. And if you recall from the earlier videos, it's not very talkative. In other words, it just sits there, which means that you probably need to verify that it is working. And we've got a couple of options. One way is that you can simply use nmap to verify that your Apache web server is running. And it should be running on 127.0.0.1 or localhost. And sure enough, I have port 80 open. Of course, you could have also simply went to your web browser, typed in 127.0.0.1, and assuming that you have a default page set up for your web server, then you would have seen, in this case, welcome from HTML. But how do we actually get to the file that we have on our file system? Well, it's important in this example that you recognize where you are in your website's root folder, in this case, htdocs. That will vary depending on your Apache server installation, or for that matter, your web server installation period. However, you notice that I have all of my files currently in the root directory just to make life a little easier. And so what I can do is I can simply specify that I want to run my collect_03.html. Now, ultimately, we'd like to link this a little better. As a matter of fact, you probably can just go ahead and create a landing page for all of your examples. Again, we'll cover that in a later video. But what I'd like to do is go ahead and populate the name and the email address. And this time around, I want to click submit. And you can see that unlike before, where I just got the contents of the PHP script thrown back at me. I now have the PHP processed on the server with the first name parameter as well as the email parameter being passed to it, parsed, and then simply returned back in a little friendlier of a message. And again, hopefully this starts to make sense. Take a second to revisit each of the files to make sure that you understand what's going on here. But the first one, of course, is your collect_03.html, which is essentially nothing more than a static HTML page with a form on it. The key thing is that the form, when the submit button is clicked, performs that action. In other words, it calls the process_03.php using the get method. The get method simply uses those URL parameters. And then the PHP script, recognizing that it has the first name parameter and the email parameter by virtue of using the get, what is referred to as a global array. We'll come back to that again later on. And then it simply pulls those values out, puts them into a couple of variables, and then concatenates a nice welcome screen. Now, before we leave this particular example, I do want to point out one additional resource here in addition to the HTML forms. And again, I'll leave these in the description of the video, but here is where you can go ahead and start along with your PHP tutorial. We've already covered some of this in some earlier videos. In other words, how you can go ahead and create your first PHP script. If you notice here in this example, it's actually embedded inside of some HTML. I'm not worried about that for this first example. I'm just simply firing text back. So if you notice, if you come back over here, and if you actually look at the code behind, you'll notice this is actually not HTML. It's just simply text that's being displayed by the browser. Again, it's pretty amazing to see how robust these browsers are. But this is, again, not valid HTML. We'll cover that in a later video. But what I'd encourage you to do is to go ahead and spend a little bit of time with the PHP tutorial so that you can sort of understand a little bit about what's going on with PHP and how it can be used in conjunction with HTML. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.